and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council in Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Securing Tomorrow, Insights from Rose Gottemoeller on NATO, Russia, and Ukraine. We are joined by Rose Gottemoeller, lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institute. Our moderator is Jim Thomson, President Emeritus of the RAND Corporation and Professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. For those of you who would like to submit questions for our speakers, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. Thank you both so much for being here, and Jim, I'll hand the conversation over to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm pleased to welcome Rose Gottemoeller here. I think we don't need to go over the complete biography because we circulated that several times. But I do want to say that Rose started her career at RAND. In fact, we have background working together. I'm going to just share the screen here for a second. And here's proof of that that's true. That's a report written in 1981. When Rose was barely out of high school. So, in any case, but obviously her interests in NATO go back quite a long ways. And now there we go, stop share right here. Trying to introduce so many technical things is going to be a problem. So, okay, so Rose, we're so glad to have you here. Let's try to get right to the subjects, in particular, given your last couple of jobs. So, you were the chief negotiator on the U.S. side for the New START agreement, which I believe I'm correct to say was the last and only existing strategic arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. But could you give some, I think, if this were 40, 50 years ago, people might know what the strategic arms control treaties were about, but could you give some background here to what this was all about? And what did it try to accomplish?
Absolutely, Jim, and thank you for hosting today, and thank you for that surprise. I frankly, I remembered the process, but I didn't remember the product, so it was good to see it somewhere still in the bowels of the RAND archives. And you really taught me a lot about NATO, so I appreciated that too when I went to NATO. My first point that I'd like to stress about the New START treaty is it's in a line of arms limitation and reduction treaties that started back in the 1970s, but went forward then until we were actually reducing weapons. And the first strategic arms reduction treaty was signed and entered into force in 1994. And at that time, the United States and the Soviet Union, well, by that time, the Soviet Union was falling apart, but we each had deployed about 12,000 warheads on strategic delivery vehicles. So the big intercontinental missiles, submarine launched missiles, etc. And the first START treaty brought those numbers down to 6,000. The Moscow Treaty that was brought into force in the 2002 time period brought the numbers down to about 2,200 deployed warheads. And the New START treaty brought the numbers of deployed warheads down to 1,550 on the two sides. So that's a big drop from 12,000 deployed warheads on each side down to 1,550. So it's a great accomplishment of U.S., Soviet and Russian nuclear arms control that we were able to, as I like to say, deal with the ash and the trash of the Cold War in this way. But unfortunately, we're not at a good moment right now because Russia has ceased to implement the New START treaty.
What does that mean, have ceased to implement? Are they increasing their nuclear forces now, or are they just not doing the verification?
Yeah, it's important to emphasize that they are continuing. They say they will continue within the limits of the New START treaty, and the United States will continue, has announced also, the Biden administration has announced, we will continue within the limits of the New START treaty, not build above 1,550 deployed warheads, as long as the other side does not. So that's a good thing, but the bad part is that the Russians are refusing to engage in on-site inspections. They're refusing to exchange notifications about the movements of their nuclear forces. They're refusing to provide us a twice-a-year data exchange as they are required to do by the treaty. And this all came about out of Vladimir Putin's misguided notion that he can somehow lever the United States to seize existing assistance to Ukraine by refusing to implement the New START treaty. Frankly, I think the Russians are shooting themselves in the foot because the United States is right on the cusp now of a modernization of our strategic nuclear forces. And so for that kind of predictability about what the US is doing should be really important to the Kremlin. But it just shows, I think, how monomaniacally focused Vladimir Putin is on Ukraine and on achieving what he wants, which is victory in Ukraine.
Yeah, let's talk. I mean, let's sort of assume at some point that we can get past this political impasse with Russia, and that leads us to ask the question of what about the future of strategic nuclear arms control? And you brought it to my attention, but you were on the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, which released its report about 3 weeks ago. And it's a really interesting report. People who want to get it can go to the Institute for Defense Analysis website, ida.org, to download it. But one of the principal recommendations of the commission, though, is that the U.S. strategic posture needs to account for not solely Russian capabilities, but also Chinese, because of the buildup in Chinese strategic nuclear capabilities, to the point where it argues they are basically should be treated as equals by us. Well, that in the past, when we were dealing with strategic posture, it was only Russia. So it was a bilateral arrangement, and that worked quite well analytically with the framework of the arms control. But now with a trilateral, or maybe even more multilateral framework, how does one put together an approach to arms control with this different kind of world?
Oh, it's no question it'll be more complicated, Jim. And I think a lot of good people have been thinking about this for some period of time. Let me first stress the speed with which the Chinese are now building up their nuclear forces. They always kept a rather small nuclear force. As I said, the US and Russia each has 1,550 deployed warheads on strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, missiles, and other platforms. So China, by contrast, for many years had well under 500 total warheads. And now all of a sudden we see them steadily building up. And the Department of Defense, in a report last year, said that by the year 2035, they will be up to 1,500 total warheads. Now, I always stress here that 1,500 total warheads, the US and Russia both have between 400 and 5,000, 4,000 and 5,000 total warheads, of which 1,550 are deployed. So I always say there's no reason to panic here, but we have to take account of the fact that the Chinese are building up, and they're also building up very capable long-range missiles, including missiles that can attack the United States directly. So that's why there's a lot of thinking now about how to incorporate them in this system of negotiated controls. I always like to think about it as negotiated predictability. All of the nuclear weapon states are better off if we have some idea about what the other side is doing, what the other sides are doing, so we don't throw money at the nuclear weapons problem when we don't need to. Conventional forces obviously are much more important in terms of our defense and security overall. So that predictability is super important, and for that reason, we are looking for ways to bring China to the negotiating table. It seems to be a good moment right now. I've seen in the press this week that the United States and China have announced in the coming days that there will be a consultation on arms control and non-proliferation issues. And it's to happen rather shortly. And I think this is a really good development because the Chinese have been pretty standoffish about talking to the United States bilaterally about this matter. In terms of what's going on with Russia right now, the United States has offered the Russians, let's start talking without conditions, without preconditions, even though we are very concerned about their invasion of Ukraine. Nevertheless, nuclear arms control is one of those existential problems for the human race that it's only responsible that we should be trying to talk to each other about them, no matter what else is going on.
Very good. Let's hopefully something can come of that. You know, one of the issues that covered in the report of the Congressional Commission on Strategic Posture is our allies. And of course, when we talk about and it makes the case that because our allies depend on the United States, at least many of them depend on the United States for their deterrent, their extended deterrence. That's important to consult with them about what's going to happen in future arms control negotiations, or for that matter, what happens with our own strategic posture. We're putting aside arms control negotiations. And of course, the British and the French have their own forces, and well, they're, I think, even smaller than the Chinese, but the ones that you just described. But what do we need to do with our allies as we move ahead with our posture?
Well, first and foremost, we need to keep them informed. That means really solid consultation. And there is a long tradition of that in NATO with the so-called nuclear planning group, where the United States and the NATO allies consult together very closely on our extended deterrent capabilities, which we do have some nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, and the Europeans deploy the dual capable aircraft on which they would be carried in the terrible event that they ever needed to be launched in wartime. So there is a great deal of cooperation that goes on all the time between NATO capitals in Europe and the United States on the extended nuclear deterrent. And that's, as I said, a well-established tradition. Interesting now, I think, is what is going on in Asia with Japan and the ROK. There's been, I think, some real concern with the buildup, again, of Chinese military capability and capacity, including nuclear capability. Our Asian allies now are very, very concerned about what's going on in their part of the world. So the United States has been doing its best to bolster confidence in the extended deterrent in Asia. Some of you may have seen pictures of a U.S. huge strategic strike submarine, boomers we call them, surfacing in an ROK port. The message is supposed to be very clear from that huge platform that the United States is truly committed to the deterrence of nuclear aggression in Asia. In addition to which, there's been a lot of efforts to bolster consultation with the Japanese and the South Koreans as well, including this so-called Washington Declaration from the past spring, when the ROK president visited in Washington, and he and President Biden agreed on this declaration that bolsters extended deterrence consultations with South Korea. And I think that's a good sign of the way the United States, both with hardware steps, but also in terms of consultation, is trying to bolster extended deterrence confidence in Asia as well.
Yeah, that's really, I'm glad you brought that up. We had on this live stream about 9 months ago, Ambassador Kathy Stevens, we talked about this topic, and but at that point, of course, these consultations you just were talking about hadn't happened yet, and the issue was what to do about how to reassure South Korea that the U.S. would be there. And I think these steps you just described are really important, because the then new prime minister or president, I can't remember which one he's called in Korea, had said something about maybe Korea needed to get its own nuclear weapons, which of course put chills down the spine of everybody in the region, and including the United States. So I think I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I should mention, in the case of ROK, of course, they have a nuclear neighbor to the north, DPRK, so there are certain political pressures in the South Korean body politic to build up their own nuclear weapons capability. They do have fissile material because they have a very large civil nuclear energy program, and that gives them, the fissile material they would need to produce nuclear weapons. But the United States, as well as other countries around the world and in that region, want to avoid that kind of nuclear proliferation. By the way,
Very
Jim,
good.
that's an important point. Just coming back to the Strategic Posture Commission report, I thought one of the most important conclusions with regard to the NATO allies and our allies in Asia is that the fact that the United States does have capable nuclear weapons and conveys this deterrence commitment to our allies in Asia and Europe, this is actually a really strong non-proliferation step. It prevents countries who are our allies from feeling like they need to build up their own nuclear weapons programs. People forget, but back when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was agreed in the 1960s and came into force in the early 70s, there were a lot of nuclear weapons programs in Europe, including the Germans, the Swedes, the Swiss, the Italians. It was amazing, and we could have had a lot of nuclear proliferation in Europe if it had not been for that US extended deterrent commitment to NATO.
Excellent. Well, let's now we'll start to slide into your career at NATO. One of your former colleagues, person I know well, and so I'm sure you do too, Camille Grand, who's no longer at NATO, which means he can write papers and say things that he wouldn't do when he was in NATO. But he's written a paper recently about the NATO nuclear posture post the invasion of Iraq and the resurgence of the Russian threat and the expansion of the alliance to Poland and the Baltic republics and Romania, countries that border on Russia or near Russia, Belarus and Russia. And he argues that the posture that currently exists is not good enough because it doesn't have enough options in it for deterrence. And he argues that the US should, with our allies, return to some kind of force of intermediate range nuclear weapons of the same category that were banned by the INF Treaty back in the 80s. But the INF Treaty went out of force several years ago now. And so he thinks we need to go ahead with that. I actually think his argument is pretty good. But I think it's going to be very hard to convince anybody in Europe that they ought to deploy a new nuclear system in these countries. But I wanted to get your view on this.
Yeah, there are a lot of angles we could come at this question from. But first, let me start with what was happening back in the 1990s when the Clinton administration at the time was considering enlargement of NATO, talking to countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Poles and others very keen to come through the door of the alliance for their own security purposes. And at that time, the United States committed not to the so-called 3 no's, that it had no need, there was no threat, there was no need, there was no requirement to extend nuclear deployments beyond the currently existing deployments in the basing countries in NATO Europe. And essentially that meant that there would be no nuclear weapons deployments extended to the newer members in Central and Eastern Europe. And, there's been some criticism raised about that. Again, in Warsaw, the Poles are probably the loudest in criticizing that. But my view is that this has been stabilizing, and that extending nuclear deployments into Central and Eastern Europe would be destabilizing. I'm also going to refer to the decision that was made when Russia violated the INF Treaty by building and deploying a new intermediate range ground-launched missile called the 9M729. At the time, the Trump administration decided in 2019 that we had to withdraw from the INF Treaty, and all of the NATO allies agreed because the new threat was unequivocal. That missile was being deployed in Russian part of Europe, west of the Urals, and it could range every single NATO capital. And so at the time, the Trump administration, with the agreement and after consultation with the NATO allies, withdrew from the INF Treaty because the Russians had violated it. Now the Russians are, it's interesting, Putin himself has come around and said, wait a minute, we need that thing because those missiles, if they are deployed in Europe, in NATO Europe, are fast flyers that could attack Moscow with very little warning. It's the same conundrum they faced back in the 1980s when they decided that they would enter into the INF Treaty to begin with. So I think actually we should be looking at restoring those constraints in Europe And but depending on the decision that NATO has made to, if necessary, deploy conventionally armed intermediate range missiles in Europe as a response. But I stress bringing new nuclear weapons and new nuclear capabilities into NATO Europe, I think, is destabilizing. And I would much rather see us go down the route of a moratorium on such missiles in Europe. And by the way, when Putin and Xi got together on February 4th of 2022, just a couple weeks before the Russians invaded Ukraine, Putin and Xi were talking about moratoria in both Europe and Asia. So here's an area, we were talking about arms control with China a few moments ago. Here's an area I think where we ought to open up that topic, because here's an area where the Chinese have some equality of capability. They've got missiles in that range, and maybe they would be interested in banning nuclear armed missiles in intermediate ranges that are ground launched. So we'll see, but that's my view. Let's look to the arms control solutions here rather than think about deploying more nuclear capabilities among our allies.
Very good. I didn't have all that background. That's really very, very interesting. And so, okay, let's turn now to the war in Ukraine and to the alliance. Of course, I think you came to NATO as the Deputy Secretary General after the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but not too long afterwards. And you left before the second invasion. But how would you grade the alliance in its handling of this crisis, the war and the need to help of Ukraine and so forth? What would be your high points?
Well, you know me, Jim. I made most of my career working on bilateral nuclear issues regarding the USSR and the United States, and had never, aside from our great work together back in 1981, I didn't really spend much time in my career working on NATO issues. So it was an education for me coming to NATO, to be honest. And I came with a great degree of skepticism because I had heard that NATO was very slow in its decision making. There was a lot of criticism when I was arriving in 2016 that NATO was not fit for purpose in terms of its decision making. I came right after the Warsaw Summit in 2016 when the NATO alliance agreed that they would put in place 4 battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland. And that would be to serve essentially as a deterrent to Russian aggression against the Baltic states and Poland by putting units from every single NATO country into those into individual states, the Baltic states and Poland. So not every battle group had, allies from the, at that time, 27 countries, but it was important that across that group of 4 countries, there were NATO allies from every single NATO country. The point being that if Russia was going to attack, it would know it was attacking all of NATO, and there could be no question that NATO would respond via Article 5 and its commitments to respond in that case. So it was an important step, but I came in 2016, I said, there's no way they're going to get these battle groups deployed, trained up, and certified in 1 year. That was the goal. And I'll tell you, I was super surprised because by July of 2017, and I went to visit the battle groups, I saw with my own eyes, they were trained, deployed, and certified. And I was extremely impressed with how NATO was able to move when it had to against a really strong threat at the time seen following the invasion of Crimea in 2014. So I think NATO has responded well to this crisis, and I think it started well before the second invasion. Their alertness to the necessity of upping their defense game with regard to the Russian Federation was very clear during my time. Now, President Trump was very frustrated with the NATO allies for not spending enough money on their own defense. I got to say, Jens Stoltenberg, my boss, the Secretary General, and I, as his deputy, we both felt the same way. They needed to put more money into their own defense. So we welcomed President Trump's pressure on the alliance during the period I was there. But now they truly, I think, are focused hard on what they need to do to deter and defend, as well as assist Ukraine. And that's a great thing.
Let's talk a little bit about the defense spending. And I think the last time I looked at the charts, I mean, things have moved. The people are moving up in terms of percentage of their GDP and spent on defense, generally moving up, but it's pretty slow. And the number of countries that are now meet the goal of 2% of GDP is maybe 1/3 of the total. But the one big one, the important one is it's not what Luxembourg does, it's what does Germany do. And in Germany, it's Germany had cut itself back to a very low level of defense spending, and that had consequences for its forces to the point that they were some way, there was sort of a clown car of forces. I mean, they couldn't fly airplanes, the tanks wouldn't operate, and things like that. But then they went through this rethinking of their defense commitment, which happened with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, and this so-called Zeitenwende, which maybe you can pronounce because your name is a German, but which means basically a turning point. But what do you make of what's happening with Germany? Do you think it's going to really step up to the plate, or we think we're going to see more of the usual kind of German delay?
Well, the most important thing for me, Jim, was, and I mentioned it a little while ago, the Germans finally made their decision with regard to modernizing their dual-capable aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Those ancient Tornadoes, you're right, couldn't fly. They were being cannibalized to keep others of them repaired. Really a dire problem, and their life extension was not possible anymore. So they faffed about, as my British friends would like to say, for a long time, unable to make a decision. But then with the invasion of Ukraine, they did decide to purchase the F-35 in dual capable form and move forward with that. And to me, that was really a signal that they had crossed a significant decision divide and were ready to move forward now and put more money into defense. What worries me now, just reading the papers and watching what's going on in Berlin, is it is a rather fragile coalition government. As always, that complicates the debates and discussions. I haven't yet seen signs in Berlin of what's happening in some other places in Europe, by no means, where there's been some doubts expressed about providing additional assistance to Ukraine. The biggest case is following the election in Slovakia. We've seen some of that going on, coming from Bratislava. But honestly, I really think that the Germans have passed a decision-making divide and are moving now to refurbish and modernize their armed forces. And they need to. You're absolutely right that they were not ready, operationally ready.
Very good. We'll talk about. So we've seen, we're getting now toward the issue of what's happening politically in the U.S. and in other countries in Europe regarding aid to Ukraine. And I've seen recently several statements by members of Congress that the Europeans are not doing anything, and basically they're dragging their feet. They're not doing enough. And that's almost always a reasonable critique of the European allies. But on the other hand, I don't think it's actually accurate in this case. Right. I think in fact, I believe in terms of the total spending on assistance to Ukraine, the European allies have done more than we have in terms of total dollars. Now they have somewhat different. We're higher on the military assistance, and they're higher on the economic assistance, but they're there doing as much as we are. So what do you think about it? You have the same idea of this, what's happening there?
First of all, I think the European allies took some immediate steps which really helped Ukraine quickly. Essentially, the Central and Eastern European allies, who are former members of the Warsaw Pact, a lot of them were still deploying Warsaw Pact era equipment, tanks, other armaments, and munitions that are of caliber that the Ukrainians could use. So they emptied out their own stores to send to Ukraine very quickly. So they were fast off the mark with that. I mentioned a moment ago Slovakia. They were the first one to get an air defense system to the Ukrainians. It's a shame now. I think, of course, democracies are democracies, and governments change, but it's a shame that they've moved away from that willingness to provide urgent assistance to Ukraine. But that was the first phase of this war, and I really give a lot of credit to the allies in Eastern and Central Europe for helping out immediately in that way. And since that time, they have been pushing the envelope in terms of getting certain kinds of capabilities into the hands of the Ukrainians, such as F-16 fighters, for example. And the first ones are now apparently, well, the Ukrainian pilots are in training, I know, and the aircraft are starting to arrive in Europe to be transferred to them. So it's it's been to me a real sign of the commitment of the European allies on a security and military front to be of strong assistance to the Ukrainians. But the other part is, and here you're quite right, the European Union has picked up essentially the responsibility to be thinking ahead about reconstruction of Ukraine and how it's going to be financed. Will it be financed from frozen Russian assets? I'm not a banker, but I happen to think that's a good idea. So the EU is already far down the road planning and preparing for reconstruction of Ukraine, and also providing a lot of humanitarian and economic assistance right at the current moment as well, to help keep the Ukrainian government moving at a time when their economy is severely contracted because of the Russian invasion. So all in all, I don't agree with the argument that the Europeans are not doing enough.
Thanks. Well, before we turn this over to the audience for questions, I just want to first I want to say I was going to early on congratulate you on your honorary doctorate from the Rand Graduate School this year. I guess it was in June, so congratulations on that. Also, thinking back, I put up that report from 1981, but you were actually in 1981 a specialist on the Soviet Union. And in fact, you were in grad school learning more about that when we did that project together. So, now with all your whole career, studying Soviet Union and Russia, do you see a way out of this ongoing conflict in Ukraine, or can you imagine any kind of any shape of an agreement that would bring it to an end?
Wars do end, and so this one must end in some form. I'm not going to endorse any particular idea. I do note that there are a couple ideas out there of how it may end. One thing I do want to stress is the Russians seem to have gotten themselves wrapped around the axle on the notion that the United States seeks the strategic defeat of Russia and its total dismemberment and regime change. I don't see how that can be at all stabilizing for our allies in Europe, to have a Russia gripped by chaos right on their borders. So I think it's ridiculous that the Russians have gotten themselves wrapped around this idea and are accusing Washington of this at every turn. I know some politicians perhaps have been saying that, but it doesn't make sense from a strategic and security perspective for the United States or its allies. And that goes also for Asia, by the way, not only Europe. Others have been talking about coming out of this with some form of security guarantees all around for the Ukrainians first and foremost, but also for the Russians. This was the approach that actually was on the negotiating table, and that President Zelensky, as well as Putin, were supporting early in the war, to have some form of mutual security guarantees. What those would look like, I can't say, but to me that seems the most positive kind of outcome to try for as the war would be coming to an end. But there are other options out there. Clearly, we look at DPRK and ROK. There's a war. Actually, I suppose we can say that didn't end. The shooting stopped, but there's no peace agreement, and there's they've had a long-running standoff, and it has become highly militarized, including nuclear weapons on the DPRK side. So I don't actually think that's a very good outcome, but people talk about it as being one other outcome to consider. So we shall see how this goes, but at the moment, I think we need to continue to support in every way we can the Ukrainian president's clearly stated objectives to ensure that no Russian troops remain on Ukrainian territory, and that's Ukrainian territory within its internationally recognized borders.
Okay, very good, Rose. I'm going to now turn this over to Rachel Kenderdine, who's been collecting questions from our audience, and for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be answering your questions. So thanks for the questions, and Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim, and thank you so much to Rose again for being here. So our first question, what do you think about Russia de-ratifying CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty?
Well, I think it's idiotic. Russia has so little moral high ground left on which it was standing, and for it to tear apart the one scrap that it had ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The United States and China have not ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So it, among the nuclear weapons states in the Non-Proliferation Treaty system, that is UK, France, Russia, China, and the United States. So it was on moral high ground by comparison with the United States and China, and now it's thrown that away. It does not seem to have any actual effect in the immediate term. The Russians have said they will not test as long as the United States does not engage in explosive nuclear testing. Furthermore, they are continuing their commitment to fund the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna and take part in those activities. So that, I suppose, is positive, but I do think it's alarming. Part of the nuclear saber rattling that the Russians have undertaken, beginning with the top with President Putin, but they have been threatening to return to testing, and I think we're going to have to watch the activities at the Russian nuclear test site in Novaya Zemlya very, very carefully and very closely, because I think, to be honest, I'm concerned they'll use any excuse to return to explosive nuclear testing. And in that case, others will test as well, and we will again see unraveling of a significant nuclear moratorium that is held. Only the North Koreans have tested in this century. So for Russia to say that they're ready to test, well, it's one more sign that they're turning into a giant nuclear pariah state like the North Koreans, only they have 5,000 nuclear weapons and the North Koreans have fewer than 100. So it's quite a big difference.
Our next question is, what should the U.S. be doing to try to make the 2026 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference a successful one with an agreed report?
I think, well, for those of you who don't know about the NPT review cycle, there are normally 3 preparatory meetings, and then every 5 years there's a review conference. So we just had a preparatory meeting this past August, and actually the countries there were pretty close to having an agreed report, which was a good sign. It was kind of a roadmap for the future with some ideas about nuclear risk reduction and working nuclear energy as well as non-proliferation topics as well as on the disarmament side. But at the last minute, the Russians and I think it was for political reasons. They didn't want to be seen as agreeing on anything with the United States. That's all I can tell. So it's another example of where politics is impinging on the necessity of controlling this existential threat, nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. So first of all, I hope for the RevCon we will have a better overarching environment politically where the Russians will cease linking everything to their war in Ukraine. So let's hope for that. That's the first thing that's going to happen, I think. But otherwise, some of the events that we see going on now, I think, are really perhaps showing the way to a successful review conference coming up in the next 4 years or so. That would be a continuing discourse between the United States and China on where we go from here with nuclear stability and nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. So I think that could be a really perhaps healthy backdrop to develop an agreed consensus report for the review conference. But again, it depends on the Russians and what their mood's going to be. Are they going to continue to be the spoiler, or are they going to be willing to be more supportive and cooperative of coming to consensus?
So, staying on kind of the same general topic, this audience member asked, where does the Global Zero movement stand?
I am sorry to say that the Global Zero organization has gone out of existence recently. This was a great organization started by Dr. Bruce Blair some years ago, and it did a huge amount of work to advance the disarmament agenda over many, many years, including during President Obama's time in office when I was serving as his Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Global Zero was working hard to advance President Obama's goals laid out in Prague in a speech in 2009 about working to achieve the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Now, Obama always said this was a goal that was long-term, not to be achieved in his lifetime, but having U.S. policy really pressing in that direction was valuable, and Global Zero was backing that process up. But I think it's a sign, frankly, of the way the world has been going, that we have now a very threatening environment with Russia rattling the nuclear saber in particular. And that's causing a lot of people to be very concerned and thinking that, well, is control of nuclear weapons really possible going forward? I have to believe it is. Again, I think it's an existential necessity to work on arms control and reduction. But there are a lot of other people who are questioning that.
So, our next audience member says, speaking of proliferation, what is the outlook for wealthy nations in the Gulf, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, developing nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles to counter Iran?
Well, I think it's important to be clear that we are all concerned about that kind of nuclear proliferation, but there are safeguards in place and constraints in place. Uh, Safeguards, for example, on the civil nuclear program of the UAE. Saudi Arabia is still in the process of negotiating its agreement for nuclear cooperation with the United States, so-called 123 agreement. All of this was part, by the way, of the discussions that were going on to establish a peace process, a peace essentially recognition between Saudi Arabia and Israel that's now been overturned, at least for the foreseeable future, I suppose, by this terrible crisis in Israel and Gaza. So, to be honest, I think it's an area where the United States must be very alert and working closely with countries in the region to ensure that we are not going down a path of nuclear proliferation there and not seeing new nuclear weapons programs emerge, because these states are non-nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they are committed to remaining non-nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So basically, we have to be alert that they are continuing to live up to those commitments.
I want to go to a follow-up that just came in, I believe, on your last question. This audience member asked, what is your view of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons?
Yeah, well, this is a treaty that came about. It's called in shorthand the Nuclear Ban Treaty. While I was again serving President Obama as Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. So it won't surprise listeners, I suppose, that I continue to believe that the official position of the United States is the right position. And that is that we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty already, which is a carefully crafted treaty, including with its associated nuclear safeguards that are implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency and other measures to ensure that countries are living up to their commitments under the NPT. I thought the ban treaty was negotiated in such a way as to undermine the NPT by having lesser standards, for example, on the nuclear safeguard side. So, if you ask the ban treaty community, they'll say, well, we're here to support the NPT and to support its objectives. When I look at it, I say, to me, it looks like it's undermining the treaty and weakening its objectives. So there is a really, I think, vigorous debate that will continue to go on this. But now the treaty has entered into force. the nuclear ban treaty is entered into force, I do think that the two communities need to come together, and especially at this time of crisis, where, as I said, many people are raising doubts whether it's possible to continue to control and limit nuclear weapons. The two communities need to come together. They need to really make sure that their objectives are meshed in terms of ensuring that, in fact, we're not going spiraling downwards into an era of new nuclear proliferation. And that includes the other piece we were talking about a few moments ago, the specter of nuclear testing beginning again. We've made so much progress since the Cold War on controlling the nuclear weapons that I think we don't want to go back to the future in this case and go back to an era where nuclear weapons are highly emphasized in the security policies of countries around the world. It's a recipe for instability and nuclear catastrophe.
So we've had a question come in on the Russia-Ukraine front. This audience member asked, how significant is it that Russia has started deploying battlefield nukes and nuclear-capable planes to Belarus? Is it just another example of Russia moving toward a level playing field with the US regarding nukes in Europe?
Yes, I think that is an aspect of it, and I thank the viewer for asking the question, because I should have mentioned in talking about the CTBT and Russia's deratification that that's part of the argument that the Kremlin has advanced for them deratifying it. We just need to be on a level playing field with the United States. And so that's the argument they have advanced for bringing nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles to Belarus. By the way, I'm not sure that that actually has been confirmed. Certainly it's been a clear statement of policy, but whether the deployments have actually occurred, I'm not 100% certain of that. But nevertheless, it's the same argument that, well, if the United States gets to have nuclear weapons on the territories of its allies, then Belarus is going to be our ally, their one ally that has nuclear weapons on its territory. So in the end of the day, though, I don't see much strategic effect. And people ask me this all the time, is there some strategic effect here because the weapons have been moved closer to the borders with NATO? Well, Russian Federation deploys very capable systems in all ranges. I mentioned how their new INF missile can range every single capital in NATO, from up in the north way down to Lisbon and Madrid in the south. So I don't really see any strategic effect or important implication of this deployment, but it is, I think, a sign once again of Russia behaving like a very large nuclear pariah state. And Belarus, well, Belarus is in a very fragile situation and very dependent on Russia. So, well, I guess President Lukashenko will go along with whatever President Putin asks.
Turning now to a couple of questions about NATO. What will be the impact on NATO and Europe generally if Congress curtails support for Ukraine?
I think this is a huge worry. I am glad to see in recent days the president and his entire administration making a very clear and firm case for continuing to support assistance to Ukraine, both in terms of humanitarian assistance and also, of course, military assistance. This country is fighting for its life. It's fighting for its independence and sovereignty. And if somehow they fail at this endeavor, then it is really bad, not only for our allies in Europe, the kind of threatening behavior that Russia can perpetrate against them, but it's going to give, I would say, a boost of courage to other possible aggressors, including, I worry about China and Taiwan. So I think, in some ways it's quite a simple argument. If you have a neighbor who starts to impinge on your territory, of course you're going to push back. And if you don't push back, you're going to end up with the neighbor in your house and pushing you out. So it's maybe oversimplified, and I know people argue, well, we're behind this great moat of the Atlantic Ocean and this great moat of the Pacific Ocean. So why should we be involved in these other places? But I really do worry about the advent of major instability that would come to our shores if this kind of behavior is perpetrated.
And to follow up on that response, this audience member says a major presidential candidate talks openly about taking the US out of NATO. How realistic is that, and how are our NATO partners reacting to those comments?
Well, NATO partners really experienced President Trump quite a bit during the 3 years that I was NATO Deputy Secretary General. They happened to coincide with the years that President Trump was in office, and he came to NATO frequently and sometimes was very clear about not being ready or willing to fulfill Article 5 commitments. Again, this is the commitment under the Washington Treaty to come to the defense of NATO allies if they are attacked. So he was very, very open at the time, and I know that they would be very concerned should he come into office again, that we would be seeing more of that kind of attitude and that kind of attempt to push policy. I will say that President Trump, as I said earlier, was very effective in getting the NATO allies to up their donations to NATO, their contributions in terms of their defense spending. And I think that in a way, that kind of renewed pressure on them at a time when they are going to have to address this newly aggressive Russia. I think that in some ways, his renewed advent in office, could perhaps help with that problem. But on the other hand, I am very concerned that he would actually threaten withdrawal, and in that case, I think. I think it would be a great blow to America's ability to continue to be a major strategic problem solver for countries around the world. America, and I know this is former President Trump's view, America should retreat to its own shores. Again, I'm not sure that that is best for American security and for our ability to defend ourselves. Our allies are our greatest asset because they allow us to defend ourselves far from American shores and not to have to, really worry about those kinds of threats coming directly to CONUS. But I do worry in that case, if we push away our allies, that we would be facing much greater threats to our own homeland.
Getting back to the conversation about nuclear security, this audience member says you stated that North Korea only has 100 nuclear weapons. Isn't even one or two still a concern for global security?
Absolutely. And I didn't mean to imply that they were not a significant threat. And in fact, they are a significant threat. Not only now they are capable with a long-range, intercontinental range ballistic missile from threatening the United States, but of course, with all their very extensive battlefield capabilities, they also threaten our ally South Korea with nuclear weapons. So it's a significant threat. The few weapons that they have, I don't mean to shortchange them in any way, but by comparison with what other countries have, I just want to make sure that people understand the capability that the United States has in the nuclear realm is still very, very significant. As I said, 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, but approximately 4,000 total warheads held in storage, held in reserve. So it's really quite a different capability that the United States has and that North Korea has. But the viewer's quite right. One nuclear warhead is a significant capability. And frankly, there are different ways of thinking about nuclear deterrence. Our allies in the UK and France maintain much smaller arsenals, with the notion that they are capable of retaliating if they are attacked with nuclear weapons. And that is enough of a deterrent with much smaller numbers. And so there's different ways of thinking about this problem. I know in some ways it seems like a bizarre kabuki dance, the notion of nuclear deterrence, but there are different ways of thinking about it, and I think there are different ways of considering what's the best way to ensure predictability despite the nuclear deterrence standoff. And again, I'll repeat that having predictability and having a negotiated discourse going on where you are placing constraints and controls on nuclear weapons, that's really bolstering stability and deterrence for all sides.
I think we have time for one or maybe two more questions. So this audience member says, battlefield nuclear weapons have come into the current discussion, especially regarding the regional Asia Pacific. What do you think about the submarine-launched nuclear cruise missile?
I think it's not needed. This has been a debate in the United States. We have a number of capabilities, including we're building new air-launched cruise missiles. There are a number of ways to think about addressing the problem of bolstering our theater nuclear deterrent. But this argument about building and deploying sea-launched cruise missiles that are nuclear in nature, again, on U.S. Attack submarines and other naval platforms, people have to consider what the issues are here. First of all, having this capability available, it's not going to happen immediately. It would be 2035 to 2045 before such missiles could come available. Number one. Number two, what are the opportunity costs for naval missions, for the objectives that the Navy has? And most of those objectives are related, again, to conventional defense and conventional deterrence and conventional support to allies and allied forces. So, you have to think about when the tool would become available, and you also have to think about the opportunity costs for what our Navy provides for our security. And I'm not sure that all of those issues have come into the debate up to this point.
And for our final question, do you agree with the doomsday clock being moved in 2023 to its closest ever to global nuclear catastrophe?
Yes, I did agree with that mostly because of the very, very irresponsible nuclear saber rattling going on in Moscow. And it's even been heightened since the time the doomsday clock was moved by this debate that's out there. Some of you may have seen it between Sergei Karaganov and Dmitry Trenin on one side, and a group of other experts and analysts, including people like Alexei Arbatov on the other side. But basically, Karaganov and Trenin have been arguing that the United States and NATO aren't taking Russia seriously enough. Maybe we should just incinerate a couple of NATO capitals with nuclear weapons to get them to sit up and take notice. To me, this is not only ridiculous, but it is also highly, highly irresponsible. And I am gravely concerned about this kind of rhetoric. I'm very, very glad that there's been a strong pushback from other Russian nuclear experts in the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, particularly. So honestly, that's the reason why I think we have to take seriously what the doomsday clock is telling us, and that is we are very, very close to nuclear midnight.
Well, thank you so much, Rose. I know that our audience has really appreciated your insights today, and we appreciate you being here as well. So I'll turn it back over to you and Jim if you have any remarks to close out the program.
Okay, I think I unmuted myself, but didn't get the video. Okay, there you go. So, okay, well, this was great. A lot of great questions there, including especially the last one where I've been getting these papers from Karaganov by email, and I knew him way back when, and so, but I haven't been reading them. Maybe I should have. So,
Jim.
Yeah, I've been just put them in the round file, but so okay. So I'm glad to know. Maybe I won't read them. I'll find out if I find Alexei Arbatov or somebody else. It might be worth having a look at. So just the last question, Rose. Given what's going on with all this saber rattling and opportunities for arms control, is there anybody we can talk to in Russia who is a valid interlocutor? Or is it down to Putin?
Oh, I think it's valid to speak and important to speak in many different settings. And I'm engaged in a number of track 2 discussions with Russian experts to try to get messages back and forth at a time when there's not many official lines of communication open. But I'm also glad that the United States, our colleagues in the Department of State and elsewhere, they've been trying to keep the lines of a diplomatic conversation open as well, with an offer, as I said, to start up talks without preconditions. We haven't talked about the P5 process, but among the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, there are conversations going on very regularly, including some in October. So I think we need to use every channel of communication we can with the Russians to convey our readiness to get back to full implementation of New START, to convey our readiness to start talking about new constraints and new controls, and in general to talk about ways to mitigate nuclear risks. So there's stuff we can do even if it's not possible to have a full up, I think, negotiation at the moment. We just need to keep talking, and need to keep talking in multiple ways.
Thanks very much, Rose. Thanks to you, Rachel, for the organization and for the backup with the questions. And we're going to call it a day exactly at the right moment. So bye-bye, Rose.
So much. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Rachel.
Yes, thank you both again.